Hello, in this episode I'm going to show you how I use JMeter to create an automated functional test that drives my Jersey RESTful web service that inserts records into a database. Along the way, we'll take a look at some JTA and JPA annotations and the small amount of Java code that you need to write to make this all happen. So what we're looking at is a JMeter, a very simple JMeter test. It's a test plan that is directed at my local host. I have a Glassfish server running on my local host in debug mode on port 8080. And we're going to be sending content type XML back and forth because we're going to be testing a RESTful web service that expects XML. Here's our actual test here in this thread group. In this thread group right now, I have it running just one user or thread at a time, and so the ramp up period and loop count really don't apply much. I'm just running this once to create a functional test. But the great thing about JMeter is if I want to turn this into a load test, I just type in 100 users and run the test, and we actually get a real load test on my server that easily. Let's actually take a look at the test that I'm doing here. This is I start off with an HTTP request to my RESTful web service. This is my application under the REST part of the application. What I'm doing is I'm doing an HTTP post to the user's URL, and I'm sending along this file, postdata.txt, that contains a little blurb of XML to insert a new user into the database. After we do that, we should expect back in a response a user ID that contains the string user. We also tell JMeter to extract the user ID and to put it into a JMeter variable called user ID. Then, after we've inserted the new user, we test to make sure it's there. Here, what we do is call via an HTTP GET method a GET for the user ID that we just created. This JMeter variable is the same variable that was created right here in this test. But here I'm getting the ID that I just created, and then I assert that I got back the user ID that is the one that I requested. After that, I test an authorize function and send along a user ID. Right now I just have it hard-coded for testing purposes. And here we can see the results of a test. The last test I ran was successful, so I have all these green check marks. I'm going to clear out this run and start a new run. Now, I've set a breakpoint on the entry point to the RESTful web service so we can take a look at what's going. So let's start a new test. So what happens is JMeter has started up, and my Eclipse IDE has switched into debug mode and has hit the breakpoint that I've set, which is the entry point for my RESTful web service. This is the user resource that's under the CAS users part of the path, and you can see that matches the CAS users part of the path that's here in the JMeter test. That's where that comes from. So this user resource implements the Spring class called Application Context Aware. And what that does is it allows me to get the Spring application context right here, this CTX, which allows me to get my Spring bean, which implements the person data access object. So again, that's what this implements does. I don't actually need to implement any methods for that to work. It's just a signature interface. So moving on, so you can see that annotation is standard part of the JAX web service annotations. We're saying this is the post operation, and again, what we're doing is we're inserting a new user And on the JMeter side, we're doing a post operation, so that has to match here. We've got a post. We're consuming a blob of XML, or we could also consume JSON. And in the JMeter test, we're sending along this postdata.txt, which is a blob of XML that I'm not showing you right now, but is a user object represented in XML. Lastly, this transactional attribute is part of the Spring framework, and what it does is implement part of the Java Transactional API or JTA, and this marks the beginning of a transaction. So what that, behind the scenes, what it's doing is creating a new transaction and storing it somewhere on probably the thread local store. And then what we do is we create a new person entity, and we'll take a look at this in a moment. Actually, you know what? Let's step into this person entity because we're here at the breakpoint. So I'm going to step in, and here we are at the person entity. Now this is marked up using JPA annotations, or Java Persistence API annotations. And here we go. This is showing us that this is a persistent entity, and this maps in a real database to a table with this name. And in my local MySQL database, I have a table named person, and in it are rows that match this shape. There is a primary key, which is an ID, and here I'm telling JPA to generate a new value using an automatic strategy. And in the database, this maps to a field named ID person. But here inside Java, we're just calling it ID. Then we've got some private fields here that I've mapped again into the specific columns in the database. Mostly they match up. Some really straightforward getters and setters here, a toString function for debugging, a hash code, and equals, some standard stuff. And that is all you have to do to create a persistent entity. So there's really no code there. It's all Java annotations in this class. So you can see this is really a POJO. We were stepping in here, creating our person entity. What we'll do is step through this, back out to our Jersey RESTful interface. You can consider this like a service interface. Now what we're going to do is create the data access object that lets us persist the new entity that we've created. And here we're calling the Spring application context to get a Spring mean called person data access object, which I've defined in my Spring XML file. So it comes back here. And then I've got a data access object. I tell it to save. And what we're going to do is, whoops, we thought we were going into the save method, but actually we've got an aspect-oriented programming intercept here. And what this is going to do is make sure that I have a transaction context set up and a whole bunch of container-managed persistent stuff, basically. What I'm going to do is let this fly to the next breakpoint that I have set, which is inside the save function here, so we don't have to step through the intercept. And to do the save, I just create my entity manager and tell it to persist my person. And if you watch on the bottom there, as I step over this persist line, you'll see that Hibernate, which is the object relational manager that I've got backing JPA, I have it configured to dump the SQL statements as it executes them. And you can see what it just did is log an insert statement, insert into the person table these fields and then some bind variables that we can't see the values of, but those are the values that I passed in. And we come out of the save function back through the interceptors. And finally, if we keep going out, we come back to my user resource and we simply get the ID, which will be the URI, the RESTful URI that we convert that into a URI, which will be the URI we access this object from in the future. And that's the actual return value or rather, yeah, that's the actual return value from this function. It returns a string which contains the URI of this user. And so we'll let this fly here and switch back over to JMeter and look at the results of our test. And we can see this test passed. And in the request, here's the post to insert a new user. And the response we got back was the new user ID. The next test was to request the user with that user ID that we just got back from the add user. And the response, if we look at it as XML, is the user that I just created with the primary key that was just created here. This function is really just hard-coded, so it's not really too interesting to look at yet, but it passes. And so that is how I use JMeter to test my Jersey RESTful web service, along with a quick tour of some Java transactional and persistence annotation stuff.